So today I've got some learning objectives for you all, and hopefully by the end of today's talk, you should better understand that most age-related reductions in the functions of the immune system are what contribute to your increased risk of certainly for cancer, but also for most diseases. And then hopefully by the end of today, you'll be able to appreciate the idea that exercise is a medicine, and as such, we should really be prescribing it like a drug. And then I'm sure you know, but I'm going to go over it again, that CLL is a malignancy of B cells, which ultimately impairs the function of all of your immune cells, and I want to make it clear as to what that really means. And then we'll start talking about how exercise training can improve the immune system's ability to fight cancer and other viral and bacterial infections that you might encounter. And then hopefully you'll appreciate that being fit with CLL is associated with a better metabolic and immune profile that should hopefully give you a better quality of life as time goes on. And then we're currently running an exercise training study, and we completed one at Duke, and there's a couple of other researchers out there, and so I'm going to try and convince you that exercise training really improves the immune system and the metabolic profiles, but as long as it increases your physical fitness is the key to take it away. So what I do in my lab, and the easiest way to describe it is something like this. What you have here on the left-hand side is you have a resilience and immune function. On this x-axis down the bottom, you'll have your chronological age, and on the right axis coming down is your physiologic reserve. And hopefully what you can appreciate is that your physiology is implicitly linked to your age, but it's also implicitly linked to your resilience against stressors, which is dictated a lot by your immune system's ability to deal with them. And up here you can see most people spend a lot of time in a robust kind of nature. They're able to deal with any kind of external stressor, whether it be a fall or whether it be an infection. You know, they'll have a little bit of a reduction during the stressor, but then they recover quite nicely. And for most people, the aging process continues on at a nice, slow, steady pace. And then as you get into later years of life and you're a little bit much older, then we start to see an inability to deal with these stressors. Your physiology at this point is a little bit impaired, your immune system is a little bit impaired, and you don't respond to these stressors as well. And typically this can be characterized by being in a condition that we would call pre-frail. So not quite frail, but on the way there. And then as time goes on, you might find that you'll fall into this frail state where you're really not responding to these stressors very well at all. And we're below this threshold where you might find yourself in hospital quite a lot. And at that point, you'll appreciate that many people who are down here have poor physiologic reserve. They're unable to be mobile. They're unable to walk around so much. And at the same time, they're at a really high risk of immune dysfunction-related diseases. Now, the good thing is that we have data for those crazy older people who go out and run marathons every week, that we call master athletes. And these master athletes don't seem to ever kind of get into this healthy aging paradigm. They always stay with a really good physiology. They always seem to have a really good immune system that is much younger than someone of their age, and their end of life is usually very short in a poor quality of life, and so they seem to be able to deal with stressors a whole lot easier. But they're an unusual bunch of people. Now, what happens when you get diagnosed with a disease? Now, if we assume that most people get diagnosed with a disease around about the age of 60, what you can see is this rapid decline in physiology and immunology that puts you into these pre-frail and frail states much quicker. And we know this. We've known this for many years. And what my lab is really keen to try and do is to move people off of that line back towards what I would consider a normal, healthy aging line, using exercise and diet as modifications of the immune system that we know implicitly link with the physiology. So hopefully that convinces you that exercise is a medicine, because we know that we can do this with some people. But if it doesn't convince you, I want to show you this study. This is from about 20 years ago. This is the Diabetes Prevention Program, and it was the most extensive study at the time that was used to determine the incidence of type 2 diabetes in pre-diabetic middle to older aged adults. And as you can see, it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the #1 medical journal in the world. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to compare whether metformin, which is the standard of care treatment for type 2 for pre-diabetes moving into type 2 diabetes, even now, versus a lifestyle intervention that was both diet-based and exercise-based. And what they wanted their participants to do was to achieve a 7% body fat or body weight reduction, so lose some weight within the first 6 months. They wanted them to engage in a moderate intensity amount of physical activity for at least 150 minutes per week. And they gave them these lesson plans that they could use throughout the program that was initially 6 months, but then followed on. And of course, as a randomized control trial, they compared these two groups to a placebo. This is what they found. Hopefully you can appreciate this. This is the incidence of diabetes on the y-axis, and this is how many years it took. In the green line, we have the lifestyle group. In the red line, we have the metformin, and in the blue line, we have the placebo. This is a statistically significant reduction in the incidence of pre-diabetes with the lifestyle population, suggesting that the exercise and diet that we can give to people is better than the medication. And nowadays, you might be prescribed with metformin, but you're also advised to diet and exercise as well. So that's great, but that's diabetes. And my research really focuses on cancer. Now, cancer has had a lot of physical activity and exercise research conducted over the past 20 to 30 years. And we now have guidelines. We have guidelines that give us an idea of if you're physically active and you engage in exercise, what is your risk of certain types of cancer. And you can see here that if you engage in exercise, you have a lower risk of these cancers, all solid tumors, so no hematologic malignancies in here. And then if you have cancer, again, we now have quite robust evidence that suggests that you can have improvements in your quality of life and health-related outcomes. And these cancer guidelines are very similar to the general population. The majority of the data, though, is from solid cancers, and very few studies have actually looked at hematologic malignancies. Now, when we look at the benefits, other than the lower risk, which is obviously a great outcome, most of these benefits are quality of life related, so cancer-related fatigue, quality of life, physical function, so on. And at the moment, there's no real consensus yet on how to use exercise as an immune enhancer. And that's really strange to me as an immunologist, given that cancer is an immune-mediated disease. It has a genetic background, but when the immune system fails, then cancer propagates and escapes from the immune system, takes over the body. So the immune system is absolutely central in the control and the maintenance of cancer. But what is the immune system? And a lot of people, I suspect, don't know a great deal about the immune system, because to me, it's one of the most complex human systems that we have. And I started my PhD back in 2009, and I feel sometimes I'm just scratching the surface with some of these cells. And so if I can put it simply, this is what your immune system looks like. We have two sides to it. We have the innate immune system on this side, and we have the adaptive immune system on this side. The innate system is the system that you're born with and deals very quickly with any kind of pathogen or any kind of viral infection. This side of it will deal with it very quickly. But what it does is it translates the pathogen that it encounters to the adaptive side, and the adaptive side will then generate a memory and be able to fight that pathogen every time you get it. And each of these cells has a fantastic function, unique to itself, but interrelated with every other cell. And so it starts to become pretty complex as to how they work. And so for me, what I do is I assign it to some of my favorite movies. And so hopefully here, many of you will have watched Star Wars, and I assign characters from Star Wars to many of the cells. And so down here is my favorite one. This is Han Solo. and I assign him to a neutrophil, and I do that because I know that Han Solo in the first Star Wars would just go rushing in, fight the stormtroopers, firing his blaster everywhere, trying to shoot as many stormtroopers as he possibly can. And that's exactly what a neutrophil does. It will go into an infected area and it will start degranulating, and it will start to kill as many microbes and pathogens as it possibly can until it gets overwhelmed. And then, of course, we have all of these other characters of Star Wars that I think are pretty important. So you have these Jedi Masters. This is Mace Windu, and I assign him as a natural killer cell. And a natural killer cell is one of the most interesting immune cells because it is the cell that will initially control any kind of tumor development, and it will seek out and it will destroy cancer cells and virally infected cells. Now, when those cancer cells can escape from the immune system and the natural killer cells are unable to deal with it, what you then have is this ability of these cells on the other side that can maybe recognize and identify them. And so you have T cells, and we have these cytotoxic CD8 T cells with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's able to kill as many Sith warriors as he can. And then you have these CD4 T cells that Princess Leia is assigned to that direct the actions of the CD8 positive T cells. And so together, what all of these cells manage to do is to acquire information from a pathogen and communicate it so that the body is better able to fight it. But of course, cancer has a way of escaping from the immune system. And in the case of CLL, it's a B cell mediated malignancy. And in this case, B cells are known for secreting antibodies against pathogens. And if we think of the Y-wing and X-wing fighters from Star Wars, then Admiral Akbar is the consequence of a B cell. And so when one of these cells starts to fail, and it could be any one of them, then there's a knock-on effect to all of the cells. And in the case of CLL, the knock-on effect is that actually all of the cells start to have dysfunctional properties. So here you can see these neutrophils that I assigned as Han Solo. Their function starts to reduce. You have a chronic stimulation, you have an acquisition of tolerance, and what this translates to is an increase in inflammatory burden. And if you encounter a novel bacterial infection or microbial infection, then it will last longer and it'll be more severe. These NK cells that are like Mace Windu, the Jedi Master, they start to be down-regulated in their ability to identify tumor cells and to identify virally infected cells. And so, of course, at that point, you're at higher risk of secondary cancers, an increased severity of these viral infections, and so on. And it translates to all of the cells. You know, we know that the dysfunction is prominent within all of them. So then the question becomes, well, how could exercise possibly help with the immune system of CLL? And so to understand that, we have to understand some of the fundamentals about exercise immunology. This is a fundamental process that we know happens in pretty much all situations of exercise immunology. Every single time you do a bout of exercise, what it does is it moves immune cells into the blood, and these immune cells that are in the blood are predominantly NK cells, T cells, and B cells. And then at the end of the exercise, they move out of the blood and back to the tissues that they came from. And we know that this effect is an intensity and duration dependent manner. So the harder you do the exercise, the more of these NK cells and T cells move into the blood. And the longer you do it, the more of these cells move into the blood. And the reason behind that is it acts as an immune surveillance. Exercise is a stress on the body. And as such, what it does is it increases your heat, it increases your heart rate, it increases your adrenaline response. And so your body thinks that it's under an impending attack by some kind of microbial infection. And so it releases cells that are the best capable of killing those cells, of killing microbes. And in this case, it's NK cells and T cells. Now, over many years or many months, this repeated action of moving cells in and out of the blood to be ready for any kind of infection, actually it stimulates a really good immune surveillance mechanism. And it couples along really nicely with muscle. And muscle releases what we call these proteins that are cytokines, and these cytokines are able to maintain the function of the immune system. And eventually what you have is, over time, is you have this really fabulous immune system, and you have really good working muscle that allows you to be able to avoid any kind of infections, or at least reduce the severity of any kind of infection. So that's the general hypothesis that we work on, is that exercise does this. Now, what kind of evidence do we have that exercise can fight cancer? Well, back in 2016, Pernille Holman's group out of the university in Denmark, they published this paper using animals. They used mice, and what they did is that they put these mice through voluntary running. And so mice love to run on a free wheel, and so they gave them 4 weeks of running whilst they gave them cancer. And what they found is that the 4 weeks of exercise training, compared to the mice that didn't, it reduced the tumor incidence and it reduced the tumor growth by about 60% in localized and metastatic lung and skin cancer, but also localized liver cancer. And this is what the data looks like from that paper. Here you can see on the top left, the control mice have a tumor volume that is much larger than the exercise mice. And the exercise mice have fewer tumors that have metastasized to the lungs. And this is represented in this picture here, where you have the control mice have many more black tumor developments within the tissue, whereas the exercise mice, I hope you can see, have much fewer. And on the bottom is the liver cancer, and the control mice on the top shelf here all have signs of tumor development, whilst the exercise mice don't. And this was one of the first papers that mechanistically showed us that exercise could reduce tumor incidence and growth. And it did that by allowing the immune system to infiltrate into the tumors and to destroy the tumors from within. And that prevented this tumor volume increase. Now, that's all fine and well in mice. And until recently, nothing had been done in humans, because it's a little bit harder to exercise train humans with cancer, especially when they're going through all of the therapies that are associated with different solid tumors. But our group here at Surrey, we actually have done this, and this is some unpublished data. So I kindly ask you not to go sharing this out just yet until we get it published, hopefully in the new year. But we took patients with esophageal cancer, and so this was advanced localized esophageal cancer, and they were given a prehabilitation exercise program for 16 weeks. 8 of those weeks was during the neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and then 8 weeks of it was during recovery after chemotherapy immediately before surgery. And hopefully what you can see is, on the right-hand side is the prehabilitation tumor samples, and on the left-hand side is the usual care, so the patients who didn't get any exercise or any formalized exercise, should I say. They had guidance, but they didn't have the structured exercise program that meant they were coming into the gym. And the blue stains, or the cyan staining, is all of the tumor cells. And so you can see that in both patients, there's quite a lot of tumor in there. Now, in the prehabilitation group, hopefully you can all see that there's a lot of red dots in there. And those red dots are CD8 positive T cells and NK cells that are able to identify and kill tumors. And so we think that we are probably one of the first groups in the world to have shown that a structured, specific exercise program in patients with esophageal cancer is sufficient enough to be able to infiltrate tumors with immune cells that can then go on and potentially destroy those tumors. Now, I've given you a bit of background about the science that we know about exercise oncology and exercise immunology, but it's predominantly in solid tumors and solid cancers. So do we have any evidence then that exercise and energy balance can work in CLL? Well, for the last 5 or 6 years, my lab has been working predominantly in CLL. We've found some pretty novel and exciting data. So what I've given you here is a summary slide before I go into the data. I've given you some papers, and if they have a green border, then they've been published, and if they have a red border, then they haven't been published yet, but they will be in the very soon. So what we are starting to see is that if the fitter you are, the better you can deal with any age-associated challenges that are associated with your cancer. What we also know is that exercise training with CLL can improve your quality of life, and we showed it. And this bottom paper is from a group out in MD Anderson in Texas. And what's really interesting, and I'm going to delve into this in a little bit, is that we know that dietary intake is involved with this, and it's not just about the exercise, but we're just not sure how to influence it. And so we've published this paper, which I'll talk about in a minute or two, and we've got some really novel findings that suggest that diet actually has quite a large role in what's going on. And then in our papers, here we have in CLL, but we also have in hematopoietic stem cell transplant, exercise training that we prescribe can improve your physical fitness and your immune function. But the key to it is that you have to be able to try and prescribe exercise properly. And to do that, there's a number of different ways. You can do that by using guides, and there's many guides out there that'll tell you what physical activity is. And so you'll often see physical activity as cycling or swimming or gardening, but they very often don't tell you, well, how hard should I be doing that, or for how long should I be doing it? There's ways that we call the ratings of perceived exertion. These are quite subjective. They're relatively inaccurate regarding intensity, and they can change on a daily basis. You know, if you're fatigued one day, your perceived exertion will change accordingly. And then you can use this percentage of your predicted maximum heart rate, where 220 minus your age gives you a rough idea of how hard you can work, and then you prescribe a percentage of it. But again, it's not particularly reliable, as many people have a much lower or a much higher heart rate than what you have. And so we tend not to focus on these ones. You can do it using relative intensity of a predefined submaximal workload, and you'll see many, many studies out there, and there's many people who use these ones. And some of these might be things like your ventilatory threshold or your respiratory compensation point. The trouble with them is that they're not equal across groups of people for that relative workload. And an example of VT here is that a sedentary person's VT1 might only be about 50% of their max fitness, but a very fit person's might be about 75%. So if you prescribe exercise relatively amongst your population, it tends to be a moving target. So we use this one. We use what we call VO2 reserve, where we give you a maximal fitness test. We know what your resting values are, and from that we can calculate an actual absolute and relative percentage to work at that is the same for you, who might be relatively unfit, as it is for someone who's really fit. And so the two of you are working at the same relative intensity. And what I want to really make clear from that is that when you think about physical activity, and your physical activity might be gardening or walking, and you might be thinking, yeah, I'm doing 10,000 steps per day, so I'm physically active. Exercise is a predefined movement that is working you pretty hard. And when I finish this talk, Ellie's going to talk to you a little bit more about what kind of things you should be looking out for when you're trying to do exercise. So let me delve into some of my data. How fit are people with CLL? That was the first question that we asked back in 2017 at Duke University. And what we found from our study was that low physical fitness equals a poor resilience to these stressors, such as chemotherapy or targeted therapies or surgery. And so we conducted this large study in our cancer institute. We got about 106 people who we got enough blood from. 59 of them were treated, 47 had no treatment. They were about 68 years old, plus or minus 10 years. And during their clinical appointment, we made them do a 6-minute walk test. And for those of you that have been in our studies at Surrey, you'll understand what that means. We did some grip strength to see how strong they were. And we did this short physical performance battery to see how frail they were. And we put it all together, and we brought all the data in along with some blood markers to try and figure out what was the most important things to fitness related to their blood. And so what we found is that older patients who were treated for CLL were more likely to have a low aerobic fitness and be frail. And frailty is a significant problem for any older adult and is associated with a premature mortality. Low aerobic fitness is the same. It's also associated with a premature mortality and an inability to deal with these stressors. So having a high aerobic fitness is actually a good indicator of health. And what we found is that people with higher HDL levels were associated the most with a lower risk of physical dysfunction. So in our CLL population, if they had high HDL, they had a a lower risk of physical dysfunction, outweighing all of the other clinical factors. And we found that higher amounts of small HDL particles were associated with a lower risk of a low aerobic capacity, suggesting that these lipid particles were actually associated with better health outcomes. And that was fascinating because we included in our analysis clinical factors like what kind of treatment you were receiving, what your FISH scores, so what your cytogenetics were, that are usually predictive of poor outcomes, what your demographics, so age and BMI and so on. And we found that these dietary lipids were actually the most informative about physical function and physical fitness. And so that gave us a really interesting thought process. Well, could we target these mechanisms of CLL progression with energy modification? Because we know that exercise and we know that diet can affect dietary lipids, but we had to delve into the science to be able to figure out what is that mechanism. And so let me give you a little bit of background about the unusual case of CLL metabolism. And CLL cells are a little bit different than other solid tumors and actually other hematologic malignancies as well. Many solid tumors and many malignancies really prefer glucose and glutamine as their primary energy source. And it turns out that CLL cells prefer fat fuels. And so what you can see here is healthy B cells on the left, CLL cells on the right, and the green is the lipids, the fats that are being taken up into the CLL cells and the healthy B cells. And hopefully you can appreciate that quite clearly the CLL cells are taking up way more lipids than what the healthy B cells are. And so the mechanism behind that is like this. We know that, that the CLL cells have this aberrant expression of this lipoprotein lipase, which what it does is it sucks in lipids and it stores them within the cell, and then it expresses these fatty acids. It downregulates it into free fatty acids, which affect mitochondrial function and energy use. And so when you look at a CLL cell under the microscope, it actually resembles more of an adipocyte than it does a healthy immune cell or a normal B cell. And what we know from the mechanism of this CLL metabolism is that this fat metabolism increases mitochondrial reactive oxygen species production, and ROS production affects gene transcription, it affects DNA repair, and it affects protein translation. So what do we think is going on in relation to our fitness model that we found at Duke? Well, we know that the CLL cells have this increased expression of these receptors that can take in more fats from the diet. And what we know is that HDL will typically remove esterified cholesterol. But if HDL is low in people with CLL, the CLL cells will start to take up this esterified cholesterol for their own use. And over time, what that's actually doing is it's stealing the fuels that would typically go to your muscle and your heart to provide them for energy that they need to be able to function correctly. So over years of having CLL cells, we start to see an inability of the muscle and the heart to be able to function properly. And the consequence of this is that the mitochondrial function within, or the energy house within these tissues, starts to degrade. And once the mitochondria, or the energy house as we call it, degrades within heart and skeletal muscle, then you start to feel more fatigue. You have a poorer ability to be able to function, so you can't get up out of your chair so well. You become weaker, and the consequence of that is you become physically inactive, and this all leads towards having this condition of frailty. Now, we know that chemotherapy causes a lot of cardiotoxicity and frailty just on its own, and many patients with CLL are still treated with chemotherapy as their front line, but it's becoming a less common form of treatment. Sorry. You now have these BTK inhibitors and these BCL2 inhibitors, so ibrutinib or venetoclax respectively. And it turns out that the BTK genes and the BCL2 genes are also found in your heart and your muscles. So long-term use, we think, with these inhibitors is also affecting heart and muscle function. And so this could be then contributing back into this frailty phenotype. And so what do we think is going on, or what do we think we can do to affect this? Well, we published this really nice mechanistic review of how frailty works. And we think that all of these can be overcome with some sort of energy balance modification. So can we influence them? Well, if CLL is a lipid-dependent cell and it loves eating lipids, then surely if we follow a heart-healthy diet or a low-fat diet will have an effect. Trouble with that is, will it stop the CLL cells from acquiring the lipids and the fatty acids? And will this promote enhanced metabolism in the muscle? We simply don't know at the moment. And we're starting to generate some novel data just now that suggests that perhaps it will, but we need to test it fully. The obvious one for me as an exercise scientist is that we can steal the fat back from the CLL cells. We know that exercise training increases skeletal muscle expression of these transporters of fat. And so as you're exercising, more fat's being drawn into the muscle, and that should hopefully steal it back away from the CLL cells. During low intensity exercise, muscles predominantly use fatty acids and lipids as their energy source. Strength training, we know, increases your muscle mass. It increases this energy, this powerhouse where energy is made within the muscles, and it should hopefully reduce the impact of the therapeutic mediated damage that the inhibitors or the treatments for CLL might be causing. So we figured that out a couple of years ago, and now we need to test those hypotheses. So what have we done to answer some of these questions? Well, we did a physical fitness study. We call this Physical Fitness Study 2. We took 20 treatment-naive CLL patients, and we figured out how fit they were, and we assigned them to either a fit group, and so they had a pretty good score for their aerobic fitness, or an unfit group who were a below average fitness score. And what we found is that the fitter group had around 20% higher HDL and about 60% lower triglycerides. We found that the fitter group had about 25% lower chronic inflammation than the unfit group, and inflammation is always a bad thing in any disease. And we found that the fit group had about a 10% higher immune cell capability to destroy cancer cells. And then really interestingly, we kind of started to identify some novel mechanisms. And we found that the fitter group had this higher expression of these microRNAs. And these microRNAs are designed to silence gene expression. And so many tumor cells express microRNAs to silence the immune system from attacking them. But muscle also secretes microRNAs that helps the muscle to adapt to exercise. And we found that the fit group had higher expression of what we think are muscle or fitness mediated microRNAs. Excuse me. And so then, well, that gave us enough power to think, well, let's put some people with CLL through an exercise training study. So in this case, we took 16 treatment-naive CLL patients. The mean years since diagnosis was about 6 years, all relatively low RI or BINE stage. And we gave them a 12-week high-intensity interval training program. Excuse me. And that consisted of 3 30-minute high-intensity interval sessions per week and 2 30-minute sessions per week of resistance-based training. So the total time was about 150 minutes per week of exercise, 90 minutes per week of vigorous exercise, plus 60 minutes of resistance. And this is what we found. We found muscular strength and endurance increased by about 30 to 60%, which is quite a considerable amount in such a short space of time. Aerobic fitness increased by about 5 to 10%, which a little bit lower than some of our other clinical populations, but still pretty impressive. Quality of life and well-being increased. And most importantly for us is that we saw this increase in immune cell destruction of cancer cells. So we took those NK cells, so those Mace Windu Jedi master cells, out of the patients with CLL, exposed them to tumor cells, and then asked the the NK cells to kill the tumors. And after the exercise training, there was a considerable increase in the ability of those NK cells to identify and kill tumor cells, suggesting that we had improved the immune system to a way that was now akin to what we were seeing in some of the animal studies earlier that I showed you earlier on. Now, interestingly, all of these factors were interrelated. And so as things improved, other things improved as well. Or if things reduced, these other things reduced as well, suggesting that the outcomes are all mediated together, that the talk between the tissues is working in a synchronized harmony. So that was a pilot study. And what we really need to do from any pilot study is try and figure out whether we've actually got a real effect or whether it was just by chance. So we're currently doing our second exercise training study, and we're currently running that here at the University of Surrey, and it looks kind of like this, where we've expanded it out a little bit. We now have the ability to be able to train people in person here at the University of Surrey or remotely in their own homes. And what we're trying to determine is the difference between just doing the exercise that we showed you in the last slide. We've added in some nutritional guidance, or versus a control group who don't do any exercise until the initial phase is done. And then we're assessing all of these factors that we think are talking to each other. So things like the systemic and the cellular lipid metabolism, your aerobic or your cardiovascular fitness, your strength, your body composition, your immune system, and so on. And we're trying to figure out which of these groups is actually giving the biggest bang for our buck, and how are they all talking to each other? Because as soon as we can figure out how they're all talking, then we can understand what the mechanisms really are. And it's run by this group here. This is my team over at the University of Surrey. Now, we've had this up and running now for about 10 months now. And so I'm going to give you some preliminary data from it, because I know there's some people in the crowd who are in the study. So the preliminary data so far, we have about 22 recruited. About 15 have completed the initial part of it, the initial 12 weeks of exercise training. Most of them semi-supervised or home-based, so working in their house. But 3 of them are in the gym, 4 of them were controls. And let me just say, if you're in the control arm, you get the option to then go into an exercise arm as soon as the control arm's finished. So you get the benefits that we're seeing. And what are we seeing? Well, unsurprisingly, we're seeing that we got an increase in muscular strength and endurance. We're starting to see increases in aerobic fitness from anything from 5 to 25%, so a little bit higher than what we saw at Duke. And we're starting to see about a 20 to 40% improvement in frailty markers, suggesting that our exercise program is having a positive effect on your frailty risk through modifying your immune system, from modifying your muscular system and your cardiovascular system. And what's really interesting is, obviously, we're starting to see the largest improvements are in the supervised group, the ones who are coming to the university, that we're pushing the buttons on the treadmill or the bikes, versus the ones who were trying to give you advice at home. And that's not uncommon. Now, our whole hypothesis lies around this metabolic phenotype of the CLL cells. So let me present you some data about that. So here's those B cells versus the CLL cells. And remember, our question is, can exercise training reduce the uptake of lipids into CLL cells and redirect them back to muscle and heart cells? So for this part of it, we've recruited 8 people into it, 4 treated and 4 treatment naive. Our 4 treated participants all received curative therapies, so either FCR or venetoclax for a short period of time. And so effectively our treated population were in remission, and they serve as our positive controls. This is what we would want the immune system to look like for a person with CLL. And what do we do? Well, we take a stable isotope of a saturated fat, a common saturated fat called palmitic acid. And this allows us to track where the lipid is going after you ingest it. And we can find it throughout the body in different tissues. And to do that, participants come in, they eat some Rice Krispies, and then they drink this hot chocolate with the stable isotope palmitic acid in it. And then we measure blood before the drink, and then hourly for 3 hours afterwards. And so what are we finding? Well, it turns out, as expected, our treatment-naive patients have a higher palmitic acid uptake in the circulating triglycerides than the treated. So the palmitic acid is being incorporated into the system of just the circulation within the treatment naive. And that's fascinating because we understand that the energy, this metabolism that's going on with treatment naive CLL is present very, very early on. After 12 weeks of training, what we're finding though is that the treatment naive now have a lower than before their training uptake of this fatty acid in the circulating triglycerides, and it's now no longer higher than the treated. So it suggests that in the systemic metabolism, we're kind of repairing this dysmetabolic phenotype and moving it back towards something that would be akin to a more healthier person. Now, is it getting into the cells? Well, it turns out that the treatment naive have lower palmitic acid in the saturated fats in the immune cells than the treated people. And that's fascinating because we actually hypothesized it would be higher, but then we realized that actually the fatty acid gets metabolized really quickly when it gets taken up into the CLL cells. And so hence we can see less of it within the CLL cells. But after 12 weeks of training, what we're now starting to see is the reverse of what we see in the circulation. And what this is starting to show us is that we are affecting the metabolic profile of the CLL cells and the circulating metabolism, all moving towards a healthier phenotype. So what does this mean, and what's next? Our physiological data is consistent with what we think and we see in our pilot studies. Our supervised exercise training is likely the best at improving fitness, and this is common across all exercise studies. If you're supervised, you get much better results. Exercise training is increasing our strength, particularly our muscle health and our cardiorespiratory fitness, so our heart health. And exercise training is rebalancing our cancer-specific systemic and energy dysmetabolism and treatment-naive CLL, and that really suggests to us that we need a dietary intervention. And so what we just submitted is the systematic review of the dietary effects on prevention, management, and treatment of CLL. And unsurprisingly, I'm pretty sure unsurprising to you all, is that yes, there's data out there that suggests eating certain diets lowers your risk of developing CLL, but there's nothing about what kind of diet you should be eating to manage or to treat your CLL. And that blew our minds. And that, coupled with our data showing that we can change the lipid profile of CLL cells and the systemic metabolism, suggests that yes, exercise might be working, but we need to figure out what is the correct diet that we could be feeding people to be able to improve outcomes as well. So what's next? We're going to recruit the required number of participants into our study that's going on at Surrey. We need to be able to compare these groups, these treated versus treatment-naive groups, home-based versus supervised. We need to complete the metabolic tracer study and try and figure out what that mechanism actually is. And then we need to go on and assess our immune functions and see if that lines up with our pilot work as well. And we feel pretty confident that it probably will. So what's my take-home message for everybody today? Well, we know that patients with CLL are living with premature physical dysfunction and frailty. These clinical metabolic biomarkers are predictive of the severity of physical dysfunction. And I personally believe that prehabilitation and rehabilitation should be considered early in the CLL continuum. So if you're treatment naive, you should be on a prehabilitation program. If you're treated, then you should be on a rehabilitation program, because these effects on your physical function are actually quite significant. So what can you do? You can assess your fitness levels. You can compare them to normative data, and we're happy to help you with that. You can do some of these prehabilitation and rehabilitation programs. We can give you advice. You could relatively easily figure out what your HDL, LDL, and your triglyceride levels are, and then try to figure out what your best diet might be. That's much harder to do, and hopefully we can get some funding to be able to do a dietary study. And you can start your exercise and diet journey. And I didn't come up with all of these sayings, but you can watch and lift weights, or you could be treated to a gym session, and then you could also use the Eat Well guide. And if you really want to, you can come and join us at the HIT study. And with that, I'm going to thank you all, and I'm happy to take any questions. Hopefully you all understood me with my throat issue. Thanks, everybody.